Welcome to today's episode of Academy21's podcast. Today, our theme is Navigating SEND, Special Educational Needs and Disabilities, a mum's perspective. So I'm delighted to welcome Cara Salway, who is joining us today. She's a teacher from Academy21 in our English department. But today, Cara's taking her professional hat off and wearing her parent hat and has agreed to generously to share her experience with us. And this is a really good opportunity to delve into the lived experience of parents who have children with additional needs. As educators, as teachers, we hold a real privilege when parents and carers share their journeys with us and seek our advice. We have a glimpse into their world. And the aim of today's episode is to unpack that a bit further. It's to give our listeners a glimpse into a mum's perspective on navigating special educational needs and disabilities as a parent, and hopefully ignite some new ideas for us about how our sector can best support parents when they themselves find themselves navigating a system that they haven't previously dealt with. Welcome, Cara, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here, Amy. Thank you.
Let's dive straight in. Can you briefly share your journey as a parent who has navigated the world of special educational needs and disabilities?
So this is my day-to-day life, is navigating SEND and SEND parenting. My children are both teenagers now. I'm not going to go too specifically into them just to protect their anonymity, but I am going to talk a lot about the parents' perspective. So between my two teenagers, my two children, we've got experience of autism, both diagnosed and suspected, dyslexia, social anxiety, EBSA, which stands for Emotionally Based School Avoidance. So quite a lot going on, and something we've been dealing with as a family really since the children were very little. And yeah, as I say, just part of my daily life really. And something that I very much got used to, but it does have a lot of challenges. So yeah, really keen to discuss this today.
Thank you, Cara. Really appreciate your honesty around that. And there's certainly a lot within what you've already shared that I'm really keen to understand from a parent's perspective, particularly when we're talking about diagnosis versus suspected diagnosis, or certainly that pathway that many of our children and young people go through on the route to diagnosis. Okay, so if I ask you this, there's been a growing discussion around the potential for overdiagnosis in the world of SEND. What are your thoughts on this issue? And have you experienced that personally when we're thinking about overdiagnosis or perhaps premature diagnosis?
So I think this is an issue that is everywhere. It seems to be in the media a lot. And I've also had comments from sort of family members, all these things didn't exist in our day. And I think often it's actually about judgment. I think there's a lot of judgment in the overdiagnosis discussion, where there's judgments being made that perhaps diagnosis is being misused. And I think that it takes away control, I think, from the people that are being diagnosed. So I think what's happening a lot is young people, and indeed adults, who are experiencing particular difficulties and particular challenges, are ending up being made to feel that they shouldn't be seeking a diagnosis. And as I said, I have had that with one of my children in particular, where I've been told by various people that the difficulties that they have are normal teenage behaviours. And I think it is tricky, because a lot of the things that our children go through, say for example as toddlers, may be perceived as being a SEND need, but actually are typical developmental behaviour, such as lining things up. A lot of toddlers will do that. Doesn't necessarily mean that child has autism. For me, I think where perhaps a diagnosis is needed is where those behaviours are extending beyond what we would expect in a child. So for example, with one of my children, where the kind of typical anxieties of being a teenager are out of control and are, causing that young person to not be able to be in the world and do things. And I think that's where sometimes a diagnosis is helpful. So my perspective of it as someone that's been through the SEND parenting journey is that actually I don't think there is a problem of overdiagnosis. I think there's a problem of judgment and of lack of understanding, and just lack of empathy, I think, because I think there are a lot of older people and adults who perhaps really struggled when they were young and perhaps would have been helped by a diagnosis.
Thank you for sharing that so candidly, Cara. I'd like to pick up a couple of things that you said in your answer, some words that I honed in on. You used the word judgment several times, particularly when you were talking about friends and family members, perhaps commenting, saying things like, well, that didn't exist in my day. To some degree, we can understand that there's perhaps a lack of understanding around special educational needs. And it's potentially, not that those conditions did not exist in their day, to use their phrase, but that perhaps it wasn't recognized as being a special educational need because we're coming from a different knowledge base. 2025 is a very different world in terms of our own understanding and the medical professionals' understanding, the education sector's understanding of the diversity of need that we see across the globe. But it's really interesting that your experience as a parent, you've reflected on that feeling of being judged. And I wonder whether you could elaborate on that a little bit more in the sense of whether that had impact and influence on measures that you took, knowing your children better than anybody else on the planet, you having that full 360 view of their day-to-day lived experience. Did the perceived judgment from friends and family change anything about the way you navigated diagnoses from an early stage?
I think in the early years, probably yes, because I think when you're a parent, or certainly for me, in the early years of parenting, I was very uncertain about the decisions I was making. And actually, I should say we, because myself and my partner, we've done this together since day one, and we were uncertain, and we were probably more impacted by judgment in the earlier years. And I think as time's gone on, we've become less impacted by judgment and more willing to advocate for our children and more willing to do what's right for our children and to try not to take on that sense of sort of society shame around some of these issues. And it is difficult because when you are a SEND parent, you are dealing with that on a daily basis, from when your toddler is behaving in a way that perhaps other toddlers don't and people are staring at you, right up to where you have a teenager who you're perhaps having to support in a way that neurotypical children wouldn't need to be supported. So yeah, I think in the early days judgment was probably impacting a bit more on our decisions, but more recently I think we've become more bullish in our approaches and more willing to stand up for our children.
Right. And I hear that advocacy coming through. Personally, from my perspective, one of the most powerful things we can do as a society, and that includes professionals, it includes parents, it includes the public, is understand. So discussions like this and perspective sharing through whatever medium that that looks like is so important in developing our understanding as a society of special educational needs. When we're met with families, parents that are navigating really tricky situations with their children, and to be able to do that in a space that feels safe because people are showing compassion and empathy and understanding, as opposed to casting judgmental glances or making passing comments or giving you unwarranted advice, when we can move past that.
Yes, the advice. It's the advice and the looks. They're the thing. Advice and sometimes the advice that you can see in the look that someone is giving you. That's really tricky. And it's not just SEND parents. I think all parents go through this, but I think when you're a SEND parent, it's magnified. And I think one thing that's interesting to maybe touch on is I've talked about how the media perhaps grows the sense of judgment, but I think it also on the flip side helps. So when I see things in the media where perhaps a celebrity has said that they're autistic, it's so helpful to me as a SEND parent because it's getting these difficulties and these challenges out there. When people are talking online about anxiety, and particularly if it's someone famous, I don't know why that makes a difference, but it kind of does. So it's a double-edged sword. Sometimes it helps and sometimes it hinders. But there's certainly a lot more conversation around SEND than there was when I was at school. And I think a lot of people suffered in those days without anybody really knowing that they were suffering.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. And I think certainly when you talk about to a certain degree, all parents experience that sense of, or that perception that you are being judged on your parenting.
Yeah. Because we judge parents in society, don't we, so harshly.
We do.
We really do, for whatever reason. We seem to expect a very high standard. And when you first start parenting, you have no idea. And actually, you have no idea all the way through, because when your children become teenagers, it's a whole new challenge. So I always try and give a parent a supportive smile if I see them, or even just give someone some space. Don't do that judgmental look. Always try and do that.
Yeah. And that can be the single action that makes the biggest difference to somebody who is just trying their best. My perspective as a special educational needs coordinator, which was a role that I held for many, many years, I think it was around from 2012 onwards. My perspective when parents came to me, I often got the impression that they were tired. They were tired of fighting a system that wasn't listening to them.
That is definitely my life on a daily basis. Yeah. And there is some support, we've always found pockets of support, but it is very tiring. You are always fighting. And I know this from other SEND parents, because I used to tutor children with SEND and be very close to the families. It's a constant fight. And you look at other children walking off to school and everything seems great, and it's very difficult to accept that that's not your experience. Yeah, and it's hard.
Yeah, and there are several processes going on at the same time, I'm sure.
Yeah.
In terms of accepting and redefining what your parenting journey looks like.
Redefining is an interesting word. I can remember when my older child was 3 and we first realised that he was probably autistic, and my partner said something to me, and I remember the tears, and I remember the mourning, the feeling of mourning what parenting should have been, and that's ridiculous when I think now about how far he's come and how fantastically he's doing. But there was that definite feeling that I've lost the parenting I thought I was going to have, and now I'm doing something different. And he wasn't diagnosed for quite a few years after that, but we knew from the age of 3, looking back, actually, it's fantastic. He has some amazing abilities. I'll give you an example. So with my son, he's just entering the kind of older teenage years, becoming very independent, and I'm teaching him things. I'm teaching him how to use the washing machine. I'm teaching him how to load the dishwasher, how to cook. You only have to tell him something once. And then once he's learnt that thing, he can always do it. And I say to him, this is going to be so valuable when you get a job, because employers love that, the employee that you don't have to tell them 20 times. But I do remember very clearly having a 3-year-old and being devastated when I realised where we were going.
Yeah. And I think that's a really brave thing to admit to. Just like to challenge you on one sentence in particular that you said there. You said it's ridiculous that I felt that way. And I'm challenging your perspective here, Cara, because my honest take on that is that it's very reasonable and entirely understandable that you felt that way. Because as humans, we are not designed to accept sudden changes without questioning them. And for many parents who have certainly shared their journey with me over the years in my professional role, that sense that you have this idea of what your child's future will look like and what your journey as a family will look like suddenly been thrown in the air because it's an unknown. It's something new that you are navigating. I would challenge the word ridiculous and I would replace it for reasonable.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. And I think part of the reason why I did have that reaction is as a parent, you do have this idealized version of what it will be. And that perhaps comes from society. I think in some ways I meant ridiculous because of things, how wonderful things have been. I think I didn't realize. I thought it was going to be a really terrible thing. And it has been difficult, and there have been some really difficult moments. But I think perhaps my perception was that it would be much worse than it has been. Because it's just, as we've learned, it's just a different way of thinking about things. It's not necessarily a terrible thing.
That's really interesting. And I think actually, Cara, that feeds really well into the next question in terms of some of the successes your children have had later down the line once you've understood their special educational needs and ensured the right support around them and the right attitudes and approaches for everybody involved in the care of your children. Can you share an instance or an example where a change perhaps in their environment or their routine has really significantly impacted your children in terms of their behaviour or their development?
So this is absolutely key. I think this is the thing that's really made the difference, is that ability for the school to be a little bit flexible. So with one of my children, they were feeling very trapped in school at certain points in secondary school, feeling like school was a bit of a prison. So we managed to negotiate a small, reasonable adjustment with the school, which was that if they really needed to, they could have permission to leave the site and to come home. And obviously this was, year 10, year 11, not with a small child. And what this gave my child was a sense that that possibility was there and that they weren't trapped. And actually, they barely ever used it, maybe 2 or 3 times, but it completely enabled them to settle and have a much more positive school experience. And I do have a lot of examples like that. That is where a bit of flexibility from a school is really helpful. Schools are not always able to be flexible, but where they are, it transforms how that child feels. And as I said, that worked really well. And I credit that with getting my child through the later stages and securing all the GCSEs to be able to go to college. So it worked really well.
Fantastic. And I'm particularly interested in your concept of flexibility. And I think as professionals, as educators, teachers, leaders working in the field of special educational needs, or not, actually, because the argument is there that we all work in the field of special educational needs.
Yeah.
I think flexibility and reasonable adjustment and listening to the family from their perspective in terms of what strategies and adjustments would help their young people is crucial to the role. And often when I'm mentoring new leaders or new SENCOs, new special educational needs coordinators, I will say that flexibility is a mindset as opposed to a toolkit of strategies. The toolkit of strategies helps, but actually flexibility and being open-minded about solutions and being willing to listen, that's a mindset, and that needs to be our default.
That's a really interesting one, because what I've often found as a SEND parent is that some schools will have a fixed set of tools that they offer, and they don't necessarily meet your child's needs. And again, that can come down to sort of stereotyping, being told, oh, your child's got autism, then they need to wear special headphones, and saying, well, no, that they don't have issues with sound. Why would they wear the headphones? Your child has EBSA, so therefore they need this specific reduced timetable, and then they need to build up. And that's not necessarily right. So yeah, I really agree with that perspective. And it is difficult for schools. And as a parent, you understand that. But if you can get it right, the child is then able to settle and be happy in school.
Absolutely. And we should all be sharing that mission. Yeah, flexibility is key. Reasonable adjustment is key.
Yeah.
And no child is the same as another. And so
exactly,
it can't be a one size fits all reasonable adjustment. Okay, Cara, to finish our podcast today, I've got 2 last questions for you. And I wonder if you can shed a little bit of light on them. So the first one is, what is the best piece of advice that you have ever been given as a parent of children with SEND?
This was quite a recent one, and it took me by surprise. I was reading a book and it said the best piece of advice is to look after yourself. And to begin with, I thought, well, that's silly. Why would I do that? I already do that. And then I thought it through, and it's actually really good advice, because it works on 2 levels. It enables you to be there for the child, but it also teaches and models to the child that sense of self-care. So what I'm doing now, my children are teenagers, is teaching them to look after themselves. So that took me by surprise that that's actually the best piece of advice I've been given as a SEND parent. But yeah,
that's
I would
really helpful.
pass that on.
Really helpful. And it links to that old adage, you can't pour from an empty cup, right?
Which I kind of thought was a cliche, but then when I thought it through, it really is key. And it does feel impossible sometimes, when you're running around doing the household jobs at 10 o'clock at night and dealing with having to contact school. It does sometimes feel impossible, but it is vital, absolutely vital.
Great. Thanks, Cara. And the last question today, to round off a podcast that I could, quite frankly, continue all afternoon. What gives you hope as a parent of children with special educational needs? Where does your hope come from?
I think hope's really important when you are parenting children with SEND, and it gets you through. And I think it's that your children will take you by surprise. They will always do something that you perhaps didn't anticipate, or achieve something that you perhaps didn't feel they were going to achieve. So having that positivity, I think, is really important. And both of mine have done huge things that I didn't necessarily think they were going to do. So there's always hope, and yeah, they will surprise you, as all children do.
It's fantastic. That is really, really good advice. And certainly from a parent's perspective, my children, they don't have special educational needs. But from a parent perspective, just holding space for your children's success is huge, isn't it? It's huge. We can't predict what they will achieve.
Yeah.
We can't predict what they won't achieve.
No,
we can't predict any of it. And so holding space and allowing things to unfold in the natural course of their development is something that we can all learn from, I think.
I love that, holding space for their success. That's great. I'm going to hang on to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time and such a candid conversation today, Cara. I know this particular episode delves into real personal lived experiences, and I appreciate how honest and open you've been. And I'm sure this is the first of many conversations that will help us to unpack the lived experience of parents navigating the world of SEND with their children. And it's been a fantastic first foray into this topic. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
I look
Amy.
forward to chatting to you more.
Oh, I enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Alternative Provision podcast from Academy21. In our next episode, we're joined by Neelam, our new Deputy Head of Science. Amy and Neelam will be discussing the importance of creating a supportive environment for both students and staff, and will share their top tips for maintaining teacher wellbeing.